Now call upon the two discussants, Karen Carter, firstly, and then Carla, to share their comments and possibly preempt some of the questions from the audience.
Okay. Firstly, thank you for those presentations. There was a lot of information in all three, so I hope I can pull out the salient points and not get too lost in some of the detail. And if I've misunderstood anything as we've gone through, then please forgive me for that. As Chalapati said, I think one of the things that stood out is that these are three countries that have a number of existing mechanisms in place, and I think they're good examples of what Carla talked about yesterday in terms of record linkage for monitoring and that routine use of monitoring. It sounds like the process is in place for a routine record linkage, the tracking of information. I think it was our last presentation and Palestine, particularly looking at whether each record gets to the next step in that process and how far it goes, putting the health and the civil registry data together at the end every 3 months. I think these are really, really important things that we don't lose sight of when we talk about record linkage in terms of the more periodic completeness assessment that we do. In terms of the overall use of record linkage for completeness as a whole, I think a couple of things stood out as a whole, and then I'll just pick out a couple of things for each of the three papers. Overall, these are three countries that are doing fairly well. I obviously come from a fairly specific perspective of countries that maybe aren't doing that well, but what stands out is that all three of the countries have reasonably high levels of completeness, particularly for births, although struggling a little bit more for deaths, which is what we anticipate. But even having said that, it was nice to see that there are these existing processes for analysing completeness, but recognising there is that need to go one step further, that perhaps the denominators we're using for those completeness measures are from older population projections or from 2006, so that there is these potentials to look at more up-to-date measures that may give us slightly more robust completeness of measures of completeness. And again, looking at particular populations that might be missing out. In Palestine, we mentioned Gaza, that the data from there is perhaps not as good. With Egypt, I perhaps wondered around that there's very good tracking once an event gets into the system, but I wondered about the events that don't get into the system in the first place. The recording requirements that you've outlined in your legislation are very good. They are clearly designed to give you extremely high quality information that goes into the system. The requirements around having documents for parents and documents for marriage and things like that when you register an event. But I did wonder whether that had an impact on completeness of events that actually get into the system in the first place. And I think your system is very well set up to track them once they're there, but it would be useful to know about what's not getting there in the first place. Just a couple of comments specifically about each one. So going through in order, the Philippines, fantastic program already. You're clearly already thinking about how you're going to use this next census round to do this analysis. You've got the questions in there about that you will require to do the matching. So I guess my question to you is really around, what is the plan around doing that? Have you got a process in mind about making sure that particular set of questions in the census is entered and coded? Are you looking at probabilistic matching? Clearly the Philippines is not going to be doing manual matching on a large scale basis. Are you going to look at some comparison of small area where you might be able to compare the manual matching to some of the probabilistic matching? What really stood out to me was that there are benefits to the Philippines in doing the capture recapture, doing the data record linkage in terms of getting an assessment of completeness. But in doing so, at probably very little additional expense, it's an opportunity to test some of the different analyses. and that the Philippines really is kind of, you are the ideal candidate country for working out what the different methods give us using the same data sets. So for very little effort in terms of once the data is matched, you could do a number of different things to it, the multivariate analysis, the more traditional three-source analysis, there are things that you can do to that and compare. And I think there's advantages to us in looking at how we can maybe make use of that. The other thing I guess to just pull out is that you talked about the previous methods that you'd used around the indirect techniques and which one you'd selected. And there was obviously some decisions around the assumptions and criteria of which one you selected. So it would be useful to maybe pull out for the rest of us, were they issues around migration, were they issues around mobility of populations, were they issues around the data available that made you select one method over another? Because they're useful for selecting the indirect methods, but they would also then feed into those assumptions would have an impact on any other record linkage exercise that we did that we would need to understand. For Palestine, what stood out is obviously that you have dependent systems. This link from health to registry. From a record linkage point of view, that makes it harder. From an actual data point of view and registry system, it's of course what we want to see, that there is that direct link between health and registry. It's not relying on family to make that connection. I didn't quite understand whether the population register, the ID, was run by the registry or if that was a separate entity. And so maybe if we can clarify that, because that may be a possibility of linking 3 different sources, particularly for deaths in the older ages. It obviously won't be as useful for younger age groups, but I wasn't clear on that, whether that was a separate set of data to the registry office. Where are we? I guess some of what you presented highlights the need to do these completeness calculations, because it does look like there has been this dropping registration rates for birth and deaths. And obviously getting a handle on whether that's partly because the population projections you're using as your denominator are getting older and older, or whether there's a true decrease that needs to be addressed and what's leading into that. Is there a sufficient set of data in the census that we can match? We didn't go into a lot of detail around whether the census was a possible source that we could pull out. You talked about the 2000 census, so we may be sort of a year or so away from the next census round. I'm not sure. So it may be a matter of actually the timing is right now to think about the questions that go into that next census to do a data matching exercise. It's much easier to do that in progressive planning rather than going backwards to a census that's already been collected.
The next census is this year.
This year,
Yeah.
Is it locked in, or is there
No,
space
no,
for census?
every
Space
10
for questions?
years, this year.
November 2016. Now we have four experiments, and now we are preparing for the final, the 5th experiment before the census. No. It does not contain any data about deaths.
So that was just my comment on both of the last 2 presentations, actually, that you both talked about your older censuses, and that I'm not sure I wasn't sure where you were in terms of the next steps for censuses, but this seems like an opportunity that if there is a way that we could use the upcoming data collection to be able to link it back, whether it's potentially through even collecting at the national ID number when you're at the households or something like that, there seem to be some potentially easier ways of putting data together if we had that in the next collection round, without having to do quite as much of the probabilistic matching. And just the last point on that one was obviously the completeness of health data, not just the registry data, is critically important in your setting, because you were talking about the reliance on family to transfer the data from health to the registry office. And so I would anticipate that there would be some completeness differences between the health data set and the registry data set. And so from a system point of view, it would be useful to look at both of those things as separate completeness numbers. For Egypt, again, extremely sort of, as I said, the best examples that we've seen of monitoring of progress as we go, and data linkage as part of that routine process, and I think that's great. Again, the same question around the census. You talked about 2006 census round. So, you know, if we're coming up now, is there an opportunity there, or is it something that we've missed? And the potential for capturing the national ID in that collection for some ages, can we do that? So really the same sort of comments as before. Perhaps less imperative, given the levels of completeness that you've already talked about, being so high already. And perhaps the use of record linkage there is possibly better targeted to future steps around specific causes where it's actually going to have more of a system impact. If we're reasonably confident that the overall data collection is of such high completeness, that may not be our best use of resources just because we can do it. So it might be something more to think about. Where is this going to change the system as a whole? And that's all my questions and comments.
Thanks, Karen. And I realized from it was pointed out to me that we do have 3 discussants. So we'll have Carla now and followed by Romesh.
Okay, thank you. I won't repeat all the good points that Karen made, but try and focus on a few other things that struck me. And I want to thank all the presenters because you provided very complete and detailed information. I think something that struck me across all 3 presentations was the amount of data that are collected on each event. It's not just the event, but it's the mother, it's the father, it's the marital status, it's the grandparents even, it's the place of residence, a lot of information. And that's a huge potential resource. But I think that also brings us back to what we discussed yesterday. In a sense, the more information you collect, the more the risk that the information is going to be poorly collected. And we said, the very first step is the integrity of that record and ensuring that the information is complete. So just, as a sort of general rule, I think it's really important to look at how much information is collected and the quality of that. So, and that can be done, take a sample of registration records, for example. Take a random sample of 100 and look at them and, try and assess the quality. Are all the fields completed? Are they all look to be completed in the correct way? So just a general suggestion, because as Karen said, there's so much information here, but let's start at the beginning thinking about the quality of some of that information. And then I think another general thing I thought for all 3 countries, so there is a high level of birth registration, and there's a relatively high level of death registration. These are certainly not the weakest countries in the world. So, it struck me right away that one could start just comparing some, say, infant birth and death records, just doing some data linkage within the system between, and perhaps the very first step of a data linkage process, just compare birth and death records of infants to see, are you capturing all the births and all the deaths somewhere? I think another useful one would be looking at comparing birth records and infant death records or neonatal death records with deaths of women of reproductive age in your records, because I think that's a good way of potentially identifying missing maternal deaths especially. So just some internal data linkage suggestions for all three. Then coming to the sort of specific issues on the different countries, starting with Philippines. I mean, I really wanted to congratulate you on you are carefully estimating completeness. But my question was, do you do this? Philippines is a highly decentralized system. So each of the provinces, I think, has an almost autonomous civil registration system. So do you do the completeness estimation also at the subnational level, say a provincial level, in the same way that you presented it to us at national level? And then a question that I had was, you have these different levels in Philippines, but you also have the barangay level. And then I think there are church records or records at that level, and I wondered if you'd ever considered comparing your registration records with what you have at the church levels at barangay level as a potential source to see if you're missing some records in the registration records. Yeah, I think those were my main points about Philippines. It was a very interesting presentation, and I think you have a lot of potential to introduce data linkage in different ways. But I would, as I say, I would suggest start by keeping it relatively simple, and also ensuring the quality of the initial record. For Palestine, one of the questions that I had was, so your registration system, you said you don't have any information on birth and death registration for people in Jerusalem. So that you don't have. And then I think you also said that for Gaza there was missing information in recent years. So the question I had was, well, you clearly got fairly complete information for the West Bank. So maybe if you decided to go down and do a data linkage study, that would be the area to focus on in the initial stage, focus on the West Bank, because it seems like you have the most complete data set there. And then my question was, when you do the census, or the MIX, or the Palestine Family Health Survey, does that include Gaza and Jerusalem? So that, not Jerusalem?
In the surveys or the census, we include in our work Jerusalem and Gaza Strip, while the registration system, it's not cover or both of them.
It doesn't cover both of them, right. Yeah, I was sort of hoping you could somehow do some link.
There is a different target in census.
It's a different identity, yes.
And the
yes,
registration
right.
system. This is the difficulty we faced now.
Mm-hmm.
And we can prepare some project to how to deal with this problem.
Well, I do suggest if you start with the West Bank and build some capacity and learn some lessons about what's happening at the West Bank, you may be able eventually to transfer those lessons to, if the situation improves in Gaza, for example, to start, because there used to be registration in Gaza. It's in the recent years that has stopped. So yeah, I think certainly acknowledge the challenges that you're facing there, but I think given that you have a system in place and that clearly is very good recording going on and a lot of information being collected, it would be good to assess completeness in the West Bank in a more systematic way than you're currently doing. Because
I think the most problem we faced in Palestine is in delay of the registration, not the incomplete. If you look to the coverage, it's about 99% in 2013 for 11, but about 80% in the coming years, and about 80% in the 2014. It's increasing by the time because the delay of the registration.
But that estimate of completeness you have done on the basis of the numbers of births or deaths registered and your projected expected births and deaths. But so you might find that doing a record linkage study might, you know, provide you with a more accurate estimate of completeness. Yeah.
We reviewed every year our projection by the census and the household surveys we prepared, and there is a very close results.
Okay, okay. And then you talked about doing this study on delayed registration and introducing an electronic linkage between the Ministry of Information and the Ministry of Health. Was that your plan?
Till now, the parents who go to the Ministry of Interior and register the children or the death cases. But the project after the creation of creating the national committee in Pakistan, which aim to improve the register system, they bought the project to link between the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Health for the direct registration, not to wait for the parents to register the child.
So Ministry of Health will inform the Ministry of the Interior?
Now this project is under processing,
Right.
not work. But in coming years, we hope we will be done this project.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting project. We could maybe talk a bit more about some of the details also in the next session. So turning to Egypt now, again, congratulations on having one of the oldest systems in the world. Just shows how important it is. I think, again, a lot of information collected, and I did look at all your forms. But I think one of the challenges here is that you have this sort of, the health facilities basically notify two different sets. They notify the civil registration authorities, and then they collect their own data. And the health system has an automated system, whereas the civil registration system is entirely manual. Is that correct? And your assessment of completeness is to compare these two sources of information. That's what you're doing. You're comparing the proportion that come through the civil registration system and the proportion that come through the health sector.
I compare the automated and manual system in the health offices, but it is sent by one way to the civil status. Then he takes the written papers and register it as automated system because he refused the connection between health office and civil status for security reasons.
Yes, but the origin is still at the health sector.
Yeah.
So you don't have two independent data sources is the issue, yes. So I mean, that does limit what you could do in terms of assessing the quality. And essentially what you're doing is just comparing those two data sources once every month or every 3 months when you get the data. I think you would have, there could be other methods that would I think give you much better information on the potential completeness, because right now it's all stemming from the health office. I'm just looking at your chart here. That's the origin of the information for both sources. So they're not two independent sources. So I think we need to think about what would be a strategy for a data linkage.
We need the protocol with the civil status and CABMAS to get the data directly.
Yes, yeah, exactly. A concern I had about the forms, and especially about the death forms, is, I don't think they're really ICD compliant, and I think that's one of the problems you showed about the quality of the cause of death data, because it's actually a huge amount of information on the form, a lot of information on this death report, and it's not really. It's quite difficult for a doctor, I think, to complete that, because they don't get very clear instructions about the underlying cause of death. I mean, it's a small point, but I think it comes back to this issue of the more information you collect, the more important it is to look at the quality of that as a first step. And here, I think you've got real potential problems of quality in your forms.
In the manual system, it is easy. At his choose the cause of death, then research. So the automated system will give him the code and number of the disease as a direct and indirect cause of death. The other parts in the report as smoking, accidents, it choose right or not right. So it is easy, not
Yeah,
difficult.
I think it's a bit difficult to be confronted with a form about tumours. You know, it's.
No.
But the other question I had, you mentioned now just in response to Chalapati that you're not going to have a question in the census on recent deaths in the household. And that's a pity, because that would have been a perfect opportunity for a data linkage study between your census and your civil registration system. So is that too late?
We are going to address this issue to officials in Egypt to include this question, because it's
Okay.
very important.
Yeah.
It may be one of the recommendations of the meeting. Then in Egypt, we will add these questions needed to be in the census.
Okay, and then the last question for you. You have the records that you have at the health facilities. Have you ever compared the records in the health facilities with the notifications that you get on births and deaths? Because that would be another potential data linkage study you could do, looking at health facility records and comparing them with what you're getting from the registration offices, the health registration offices.
There will not be comparison, as the data collected by the CABMAS from the civil status every 3 months, not the similar taken from the health offices, as this data from the civil status, including births and deaths outside Egypt, which be registered in the civil status, the main center. So there will be difference for the births and deaths outside the country.
Sure. But you could
But
compare those that are born in the country.
Yeah, it is one source from Egypt, from the information center, which sent to the civil status and the CABMAS.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. And Romesh? Yeah.
I'll just be really quick, because
Just a
Karen
second.
and, oh, sorry.
We have the Philippines rep. Yeah, please.
Yeah, if I may clarify the issue raised by Carla, the Philippines, through our national statistician, is the ex-officio civil registrar general. So she has technical supervision over the local civil registry offices who are under the local government units, the mayors. So we do have technical supervision over the LCRs. So with regards to the estimates on birth registration, so we can have special tabulations, so we can get the percent registrations by province, by city or municipality from the census, and then compare it with our civil registry records at the provincial or city municipal level. For our church records, they have baptismal records and marriage records, but it is the local civil registrars which have records on births, deaths, and marriages. So it's not, the records at the church is not complete. There are only baptismal records and marriage records. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chalapati. I think Karen and Carla have made my job very easy, because they've been so comprehensive, and also the presenters, the presentations were excellent and very detailed. I actually just wanted to focus on 2 or 3 really quick things. And what I particularly liked about the work that you were presenting, particularly I think the Philippines and Egypt, and I'm guessing also Palestine, these were in your slides, that you are doing work on completeness alongside demographic data quality assessment, assessing like the age reporting and the sex reporting. And I think this is so fundamental that these 2 pieces are done together. I think one of my pet frustrations, and I think one of our difficulties, is these completeness estimates which are reported by very different organizations, including the UN, are often reported in isolation. And it's very hard to actually understand what they mean. So this work that you're doing using things like the Whipple's Index and Myers Index and, these, sex ratios and these kind of things, they add an enormous amount of value to these exercises and insight into, potential data problems where we may need to look further. So I want to really congratulate you on that work. It's really fundamental, but it's often glossed over too quickly. And I'd like to encourage not just our colleagues from the Philippines, Palestine, and Egypt, but like all of us, to really lean on the principles of the fundamental principles of official statistics. Like Principle 3 really calls for official statistics agencies to facilitate the correct interpretation of data, and Principle 4 gives you a mandate to comment, on erroneous interpretation or misuse of statistics. And so I think, one of the things here, and I think Karen pointed it out really nicely, is that, and I think Aurora, you did as well in your presentation, where these indirect methods give you very different results. And you have to, and so you're choosing one. I think you're choosing Bennett Horowitz, for some particular reason, which would be interesting to understand more about. But I think if you're able to present that alongside the data quality assessment that you've done with the sex ratio data and the age reporting and an examination of these assumptions, I think it would add a lot of richness, not just to your reporting, but I think, as Carla was saying, it would help you to strategically identify potentially where to zero in and look in particular places where, a more fine-tuned completeness assessment might make sense using record linkage techniques. A question would be, is there a particular area, other than Bohol, which you should be going and carrying out, some kind of focused record linkage study? And I think, perhaps that's a way to sort of think about how to move from the very, very important work that you're doing right now, using indirect methods, using expected deaths, and reported in surveys and censuses, to a lot more heavy-duty methods, which perhaps might be better at small scale, at least for now. But one thing before we move on to more of the record linkage issues, I did want to say is that I think it's interesting, some of the results I think which were presented both by the Philippines and Palestine. I think death registration completeness in the Philippines, you reported in 2007 it was 70% and about 66% in 2010, and I think in Palestine it's a similar drop between 2012 and 2014, right? But the methods that you're using, in the case of, I think, the Philippines using indirect methods, and in the case of Palestine, using expected, registered deaths divided by expected deaths, and the expected deaths calculated from population projections. There's some large uncertainties around, those numbers, and so I'm suspicious that you can even detect a change there. We probably don't know, whether registration has improved, stayed the same, or declined over time, is my humble opinion. Like, we know certainly from the death distribution methods that these methods are subject to like about a plus or minus 25% in terms of uncertainty. They're very coarse methods. So I wanted to draw people's attention to that, not to rubbish the methods and rubbish this work, but to emphasize the importance of, I think, doing the completeness assessment alongside the demographic data quality assessment and reporting them both together. So that's my key point. So my second point really is this issue around, thinking through what might make sense in terms of focused studies, in the future, with regard to record linkage. And I'll confine my comments a little bit to perhaps Egypt and Palestine, because I'm certainly not an expert, or I haven't studied things in the Philippines very much, apart from reading a lot of your work and Karen's work and stuff. So I guess with regard to Egypt, it's a very big place, right? And I imagine things are at least, I've only spent time in Cairo, but my sense is that things are quite different in urban areas and rural areas. And I suspect, I'm not sure if there's a massive differential in percentage of deaths reported that occur in hospitals in rural areas versus urban areas. But I'm wondering whether these are the kinds of things which might be interesting to try to carry out a small focus study on, to figure out where some of these sort of incompleteness pockets might be. There's also the issue in urban areas where there's large subpopulations, right? Even in Cairo, living in informal settlements and stuff. Do we worry a lot about those vulnerable populations in terms of under-registration, and what does that look like? Does that look very, very different, for other parts of the population? So I'm wondering whether, some of these studies might be useful for you. And then I want to just close by, in Palestine, I think you report this sort of classical differential between birth registration and death registration. I think your birth registration completeness estimate's about 87%, and for death registration completeness it's about 64%. And so, I want to quote, our distinguished colleague over here, Sam Knudsen, who was guiding me last year on, the importance of, in terms of death we were talking about the different incentives around birth registration and death registration. And I may be misquoting him, but my take-home message from this was, he was like, look, one of the most important things one can do to improve death registration is essentially organize and structure and, govern the whole process of the disposal of human bodies through burial permits or, good cemetery records and that kind of stuff. So I was kind of wondering, how that works in Palestine, whether, a focus study trying to map, the sort of burial processes and where any slippage might be occurring there might actually help, and whether there's an opportunity to use record linkage, at least for a small area in the West Bank. Because my understanding is there's a huge incentive for people to register births in Palestine. You need IDs to get around. That's obvious. My sense is that there's probably a much, much lesser incentive for people to register a death. And so sort of unpacking where that slippage might be occurring through, at least at a small scale, using sort of a technique like record linkage might be at least illustrative and informative to start asking bigger questions at scale. Thank you.
Thanks to the three discussants who've provided comprehensive comments and an overview. And I think we've had responses for all the specific questions which have been asked by the three discussants. I now invite the remaining participants at the meeting if you have any other questions or comments to the three presentations. Okay, before that we have a response from the representative from Philippines. Please go ahead.
It's not really a response, but I'd like to ask my Muslim friends, because we have this problem in the Philippines with the cultural practice of Muslims that the dead has to be buried within 24 hours. So I don't know, how did they address the registration of births? I'm sorry, of deaths, because once dead, they have to be buried within 24 hours, and usually it's not reported or registered. So I'd like to know how do they do it in Egypt or in Palestine? Thank you.
Registration of this is within 24 hours from its occurrence or its proving. Occurrence means one person dead at night, 11, 12. His son come to the health office in the morning after 8 hours. It is within the limits of 24 hours. He gets the burial permit and then go to the to bury the dead person, and then next day or after that he will get the death certificate, which is given to the first degree relative, as it is related to inheritance. If cases is reported after 24 hours, it take another steps. That is goes to the police office and investigations to get the death certificate according to the law of the Ministry of Justice. That's also all cases to be notified within 24 hours from this.
And most morbid people in Egypt go to hospitals in urban area to have their care, and may they die. So, and the certificate, the notification of death by the place of place of occurrence, not place of residence. So sometimes urban areas have death more than rural areas. Thank you.
So it appears that the legal system has embedded this practice of registration within 24 hours, and there is a well-established practice, of how the deaths are reported. And in case registration is not immediately possible because of a holiday or because of the absence of an official, they have a backup scheme, to permit the burial within the prescribed norm as per the cultural practice. Yeah. Sam.
Thanks. If I can just add a comment based on my experience working in Morocco, at least in the cities, it's the death registration coverage is very good, but it's based on two things. One is on the fact that the individual, the family, has to obtain a burial permit. That's number one. Number two, the burial permit system is very strictly enforced in the cemeteries. And actually, number three, their unofficial cemeteries are not allowed. So it's that three-part system that ensures that that all deaths are notified. Also, the fact that the municipal office that issues the burial permits is open 24/7.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Danzin.
A question for Philippines. So I think probably still a large of proportion of births and deaths occur at home. So just wondering, how do you capture these births and deaths? And also whether the country, the government has a plan to make changes from to do some health intervention, like some training, really, or build hospitals in the village, whether there is a plan to change from the really fundamentally make changes for the situation there. And the next question is for Egypt. So when we are doing the child mortality estimation, we notice the recent DHS produced a bit higher child mortality compared to the vital retracing system. So in the country, how do you, whether you use this data sources, and so far you use the DHS as official estimates for child mortality, or the vital retraction data, especially for most recent years. As I can see, it seems there's some deterioration in the death registration, especially for children in the country in most recent years due to the situation in the region and in the country. So how you do some evaluation, especially for most recent years?
Before, let's just see if there are any more questions to the teams. Yes, please. Anyone else? Okay, one.
Yeah. Yes, I just have one question for Egypt, but I think it's actually a bigger question for other countries as well. And my question is, this is this idea of using an independent source to evaluate the completeness of vital civil registration systems. And in your presentation, you mentioned the demographic health survey as an alternative source. And I think other countries do the same. So my question is, when you're building the sampling frame from that survey, do you use the vital civic registration as a source, as a sampling frame? Because that definitely would be a source of correlation, and maybe something that is easily overlooked. There's an incentive to be able to have as complete as possible a sampling frame for such a survey, but if ultimately it's going to be used for assessing completeness, then that's an issue maybe to keep in mind. So that's just my observation.
Yes, we can have two questions, responses to two questions from Egypt.
On conducting the demographic and health survey, the sample is representative all the society. So all characteristics of the samples are equal to the society.
Right, or clarify, I guess the sampling frame for the DHS must be from the census and not from the civil registration.
Yes.
So that's how it's an independent sample. And could you respond to the question about the variation between the DHS under 5 and the vital registration under 5 and how you deal with it?
The last demographic DHS in 2014 and its results in 2015, and still conduct the evaluation of DHS and vital statistics. And we have some variations between the DHS and vital events, and want to adjust this variation to do more improvements for the vital events.
We'll have the response, quick one, yeah.
First, on the demographic and health surveys. So the PSA, the Philippine Statistics Authority, use a master sample of households, which is based on the population census, listing of households from the population census. But we have a master sample of households for our household surveys. And for the question from UNICEF, yeah, for non-medically attended deaths, the informant or the relative of the dead still has to go through the local health officer. They have to report the death to the local health officer because they also need to have a burial permit before they can bury the dead. So it has to be reported to the local health officer, and then the burial permit has to be issued before it gets registered to the local civil registry offices. That's why we're interested to have verbal autopsy, training and verbal autopsy, so that we can address the quality of the causes of death for non-medically attended deaths. Thank you.
I just wanted to make a general comment to come back to something that you actually said either late yesterday or early this morning. In listening to the discussions, what's really stood out to me is I think we've seen some really clear examples of where record linkage adds value to look at births and deaths that are being missed from the system altogether before we start tracking them, to look at specific issues where there's gaps, to make use of readily accessible data sources such as the censuses, where you've built in those questions so that we don't have to go back and expend resources that are perhaps beyond what we need. But I think what we're missing perhaps in the discussion is also that sense of tempering when is the record linkage not the best way forward. And just coming back to, if our key focus is CRVS systems and strengthening CRVS systems, there are times when record linkage is absolutely something that we want to do. And in other situations, we may want to come back to some of that basic mapping and tracking of where are the gaps likely to occur, tracking events through so that we can target the resources, keeping in mind this is a fairly resource-intensive exercise. So I just want to sort of make sure we don't get lost in record linkage for record linkage's sake. It's a very useful tool, but to keep our eye on the prize kind of focus.
Thanks, Karen. Sam?
Thanks, Chalapati. Speaking of linkage, and I seem to be always thinking about causes of death. So I was sitting here thinking about how one might use linkage to improve the quality of cause of death information. I mean, there's the standard approach, which is linking death reports back to patient records, which is laborious, time-consuming, expensive, and difficult to do. So, I mean, that's one approach, is consider that sort of like a massive approach to dealing with the question of cause of death quality. But there's some others that I've seen done in different places. One that's done to a certain extent here in the US and a lot in Australia and New Zealand is linking accident deaths back to, especially traffic accident deaths, back to police reports or road safety traffic groups, which many countries have now, as a way to get additional information on the circumstances, because after all, that's how you address prevention, is by understanding the circumstances. So that's one. Another would be in terms of, I noticed, for example, in Egypt that you have a whole section of the cause of death portion of the report devoted to tumors. So that must be of interest in Egypt. I assume you also have a cancer registry there. So one thing you can do is compare cancer registry names to death reports to see if cancer is mentioned anywhere on the list of causes of death as an evaluation of quality. And you could apply that to any sort of registry if you wanted to do that. And then finally, I don't know how well this would apply in any of the three countries, but in Brazil, one of the things that they do is they do surveys of informal, unofficial cemeteries and compare the names there to death records to see if those deaths have been captured as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. And just to pick up on that point which you made about the comparison of civil registration records on causes of death with hospital records, it may be a large, laborious and time-consuming and expensive exercise if done at a national scale, but these can definitely form master's level thesis projects on a small scale within, health facilities or within medical colleges or, medical schools. And those kind of internal evaluations could lead to a journal publication, as well as, more importantly, provide internal evidence for strengthening the medical record and the civil registration system. We've had a long session, and Jenny will make one point. I have a couple of closing comments, which I'm not going to let go. And we have Gilles also with one, so let's have it from Jenny first. Yeah.
I very much liked what I heard from Karen, and we won't have to think carefully when our record linkage, not the best method, to try to enhance civil registration systems and the data you get from it. And then link immediately on to what Chalapati just now said, where he said that one could have a student doing some pre-work or work leading up to linkage which is what happened in South Africa. A PhD student was told, why do you bother about ABC if you don't even know the different mortality data sources in your country? And the student said, yes, I know them. And he said, show me, where is it written up? And it was written up 25 years before the conversation took place. So that could be a way where one would go about and say, let's look at what's the mortality data sources here. It's clear that the forms, I'm concentrating specifically on Egypt because I'm going to be in a session with you later today. What data sources are there? I see your map that you draw, and it's clear that there are not many from what you give, but there may be others. So, and then after that, once you've got a good assessment of these different data sources, decide on a simple table which ones are good for adult mortality, neonatal mortality, or child mortality, maternal mortality, and get an idea of what sources I can use. Then do an assessment of each of these sources. I know it sounds so long, but I think Chalapati is perfect. A PhD student can take that on as a study and complete it in 3 or so years. Make sure that this person knows the quality of the different data sources. There's no use wanting just to link, and you don't have the necessary variables, and the different data sources are not such that you could link them. And specifically have a good idea of the quality of the current civil registration system. And what would you be able to use as a reference? For example, in South Africa's case, you could not have used the civil registration as a reference. Hospital records is not ideal. That's been found in various studies. Pathology records is worthwhile. However, that would then or forensic pathology would cover about 8% PAM, which is mainly of death for injuries, and a few other natural causes. And once you have an idea, what are the mortality data sources that sits on whatever shelf in whatever building, and what's the quality of it, then one can say, now that I know what's the quality and what is the variables, let's see which ones are linkable and do the matching.
Yes, please.
In Egypt, all disease, even this in the hospital, must get the bureau permit from the health office in the site of occurrence of this. The same as injuries, it will be notified to the police, but the bureau permit is getting from the health office. So all recorded are obtained from health offices. As we see the report in the automated system, we can take the report about this is for certain age group, for certain sex, for specific disease, as cancer, as accidents, as related to smoking, as this is of female in the productive period according to pregnancy or labor and so on. So all the data, the source is the health office. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks, Jenny, for highlighting the importance of having an inventory of all the mortality data sources in a country, alongside which should be an assessment of the quality of the data in each of them as a basis for planning linkage studies. Gilles?
I wonder whether for a next meeting of this panel you may invite people from DHS, from macro, because it's typically an independent source. Of course, it's particular, it's a sample, but it could be used with record linkage to know better the quality of civil registration. DHS people are very difficult to convince to adapt a bit, to add questions, but you should invite them, because maybe...
Because they're difficult, they're not invited. Apart from the personality issue, the second issue is that the DHS population clusters are usually in just 50 or 100 households, and it's very challenging to map them onto, civil registration data sources, unless we have that kind of 3-word geographical mapping. Yeah, that he was talking about. But in theory, what you've said sounds attractive. In having them on board, in getting them to sort of change their methods in trying to incorporate wider sampling areas which can be mapped onto civil registration, because the DHS and the mixed programs are ideal platforms to have an independent data source for linkage studies. I agree with you, but let's hope we can achieve that. So as I said, it's been a long session, but we've come through almost to the end. The comments I had to make was one very brief suggestion to the representative from Palestine, that the cause of death certificate is not in the format that is prescribed by the WHO. It has only the direct cause and the underlying cause. It should have the current format according to the ICD-10. I'm sure the local WHO representative will be able to advise you on how to modify that. And the second was in relation to what Romesh had mentioned about having the demographic data quality assessment presented alongside the completeness assessment with an explanation of the methods used. What I'd like to recommend is that in the presentation there should also be an inclusion of the mortality estimates that were derived from the registration data. Like how the Egyptian team presented the life expectancy at birth, the mortality rates for infants and under 5, preferably the adult mortality rates, because we can apply some external judgment to sort of understand whether the estimates coming out of the registration data seem plausible. In the Egyptian context, a life expectancy of 68 for males and 72 for females seems plausible, and the registration, crude death rates of 6 and 6.5 or so, and 510,000 deaths. I remember seeing Egyptian data from the early 2000s where we had only 400,000 deaths, where we could think that the completeness was less, adds a lot of value. Whereas for the Philippines, we only had a completeness estimate of 66% without any, comparative measure in terms of the life expectancy from the registration data. And more importantly, you presented the data for health objectives as with a heavy focus on the quality of causes of death. It would have been very helpful to see the percentage of deaths coded to ill-defined causes, or those kind of, discrepancies in your cause of death data to justify the inordinate focus of the data for health on cause of death data quality, when it clearly seems to be that completeness seems to be an important issue with the Philippines. So having said that, at the end, I think it was a very informative session, and it has given us sufficient basis to go ahead on the next 2 sessions in planning some initiatives for strengthening the CRVS in these 3 countries. Thanks to everybody, and let's have coffee.